Ibn Qayyim, On Selfishness, Disobedience, and Spiritual Blindness. O Allah, strengthen me with obedience to you, and do not humiliate me with disobedience to you. It is a punishment for a sinner indulging in sins to eventually be forgotten by Allah and left alone with the devil. Indeed, what kind of piety is there in a person who witnesses Allah's sanctities being violated, his religion abandoned, the sunnah of his messenger shunned, and yet remains still with a cold heart and a shut mouth? Such a person is like a dumb shaitan. The pillars of disbelief are four: arrogance, envy, anger, and lusts. For arrogance prevents him from submitting to the truth, and envy prevents him from accepting, sincere and good, advice, and prevents him giving advice to others, and anger prevents him from being just, and lusts prevent him from devoting himself to the worship of Allah. Disobedience strips away the clothing of piety and replaces it with the garment of humiliation. You will never see a person who persists in violating the commands of Allah, except that a visible darkness and lowliness settles upon their face, even if they dress in the finest silk. One of the worst punishments of disobedience is that it weakens the heart's resolve to do good. It slowly drains your desire to perform acts of obedience until the heart becomes completely sluggish, making the path of righteousness feel like an impossible mountain to climb. Just as righteousness brings light to the heart, strength to the body, and expansion in provisions, disobedience brings darkness to the soul, weakness to the physical body, and a severe restriction in one's daily sustenance. If you are blocked from attaining your provisions and find doors closing in your face, know that a servant is deprived of provision strictly because of a sin or an act of disobedience he committed. You cannot seek what is with Allah by angering him. Disobedience erases a person's dignity in the eyes of creation. When a servant boldly opposes the commands of his master in secret, Allah casts a sense of dislike and rejection into the hearts of the believers toward that person, even if they have never seen him commit the act. The continuous commission of sins completely blinds the insight of the soul. Once the light of insight is extinguished by disobedience, the servant begins to view evil actions as good deeds and righteous paths as misguidance. An act of disobedience is like throwing a stone into a clear well. It instantly muddies the water of your internal peace. The sinner is constantly living in a state of hidden terror and anxiety, forever looking over his shoulder because he has broken his pact with the Creator. The most dangerous consequence of persistent disobedience is that it robs the servant of his sense of shyness before Allah. When shyness dies within the heart, the soul loses its natural shield against corruption and openly flaunts its sins without any remorse. Disobedience breaks the bond of intimacy between the servant and his Lord. Once that intimacy is replaced by a cold alienation, the servant no longer finds any sweetness in his prayers, his supplications, or his private conversations with Allah. Every act of disobedience is an inheritance from a past destroyed nation. Arrogance is the inheritance of Pharaoh. Greed and fraud are the inheritance of the people of Shu'aib. and lustful transgression is the inheritance of the people of Lut. Why then would a believer clothe himself in the traits of those whom Allah destroyed? There is no disease more fatal to spiritual progress than selfishness, the worship of one's own desires and opinions. When a person becomes the center of their own universe, they implicitly push the commands of Allah to the margins of their life. Spiritual blindness begins when the heart prefers the transient shadow over the permanent reality. A man who navigates the world solely with his physical eyes, while his internal insight, basira, is blind, is like a traveler walking off a cliff in broad daylight. The primary sign of a selfish soul is that it demands its rights from others with absolute rigidity, yet displays total negligence when it comes to fulfilling its obligations toward Allah and His creation. Disobedience is an aggressive declaration of independence from divine care. When the servant willfully breaks a command, he is effectively stating that his own limited intellect is a better guide for his life than the wisdom of the All-Knowing. A heart afflicted with spiritual blindness cannot distinguish between a toxic poison and a life-saving remedy. It runs eagerly toward the very sins that are actively destroying its vitality, laughing while its spiritual foundation is systematically demolished. Every deliberate act of disobedience leaves a dark rust spot on the mirror of the heart. If these spots are not instantly scrubbed away with sincere repentance, they multiply until the mirror is completely blackened, preventing any light of guidance from reflecting within it. Spiritual blindness is not the absence of knowledge, but the inability to benefit from it. A blind soul can memorize the entirety of the book and the Sunnah, yet fail to let a single verse alter its behavior or soften its arrogance. The ultimate manifestation of selfishness is when a person uses religious acts merely as a tool to gain public admiration and serve their own ego. They mock the concept of sincerity by turning worship into an internal business transaction. Disobedience acts as an artificial wall blocking the descent of peace. You may look for tranquility in wealth, travel, or entertainment, but as long as you are actively defying the commands of Allah, your internal restlessness will remain untouched. When a soul is blind, it perceives the gentle reminders, trials, and warnings sent by Allah as mere bad luck or cosmic cruelty. It lacks the internal vision to realize that its own continuous disobedience is the architect of its misery. The tragedy of disobedience is its compounding nature. A single small compromise opens the door for a medium transgression, which eventually breaks the barrier down entirely for major destruction. Sin is a slope where nobody can safely stop halfway. A spiritually blind person lives in a continuous state of toxic safety. They observe others being taken by death or broken by trials, yet internally believe that they are somehow immune, continuing their disobedience without a shred of urgency. Spiritual blindness seals the ears from hearing the truth. The words of advice reach the physical eardrum, but the blind heart acts like a fortress with closed iron gates, refusing to let the warning penetrate or disturb its comfortable state of sin. A selfish believer is a contradiction in terms. The very core of faith requires a person to subdue their own whims in submission to the Creator and service to the creation. To prioritize oneself above these two is to carry a hollow, dead faith. The most frightening aspect of disobedience is that it can cause a person to lose their footing at the final moment of life. A secret life of continuous sin acts like an anchor pulling the soul down, making the statement of faith too heavy for the tongue to pronounce at death. Spiritual blindness makes the slave view the boundaries of the Sharia as an oppressive restriction on their freedom, rather than seeing them as a protective fortress guarding them against the predatory nature of their own desires. Selfishness prevents a person from experiencing the sweetness of brotherhood. A heart that only loves for itself can never taste the divine light that descends upon those who love, give, and forgive purely for the sake of Allah. The sinner who refuses to halt their disobedience is like a man trying to extinguish a blazing fire by pouring gasoline onto it. He thinks satisfying his desires will bring him peace, not realizing that the act itself is what inflames his internal torment. Spiritual blindness transforms the blessings of Allah into a means of gradual destruction. The blind soul receives health, wealth, and status while persisting in disobedience, misinterpreting this divine patience as a sign of divine approval. The root of all disobedience is the belief that you can find a better path to happiness than the one mapped out by your Creator. This is the peak of intellectual bankruptcy and spiritual arrogance. When a person's selfishness reaches its peak, they begin to view the religion merely as a tool to validate their own biases. They accept what aligns with their ego and discard or distort what challenges their personal lifestyle. Spiritual blindness makes the vastness of the hereafter look like a distant, irrelevant myth, while making the microscopic, fleeting playground of the dunya look like an infinite reality worth destroying one's soul over. The most direct antidote to selfishness is voluntary obscurity, performing massive, high-impact righteous deeds entirely in secret where no human eye can see, explicitly starving the ego's ravenous appetite for validation. Do not look at the smallness of the slip when you commit an act of disobedience. Instead, look at the absolute magnitude of the one you are actively defying. A small insult directed at a king carries massive consequences.